The concept of the superweapon or wonder weapon became a central element of the propaganda of the Third Reich. It was the last desperate hope of Nazi Germany in the time of its rapid collapse, beginning roughly from 1943. Today, you will learn what these superweapons were and why they could not save the Hitler regime, the military situation, and the wonder weapons myth. The war machine of the Reich collapsed under the blows of the Allies on all fronts, while industry suffered under catastrophic bombings and resource shortages. After the devastating defeat at Stalingrad in the winter of 42-43 and the failed tank offensive at Kursk in the summer of 43, the strategic initiative was definitively lost. The Red Army advanced relentlessly westward, while the Allies, after landing in Normandy in June 44, the concept of the superweapon or wonder weapon became a central element of the propaganda of the Third Reich. It was the last desperate hope of Nazi Germany in the time of its rapid collapse, beginning roughly from 1943. Today, you will learn what these superweapons were and why they could not save the Hitler regime, the military situation, and the wonder weapons myth. The war machine of the Reich collapsed under the blows of the Allies on all fronts, while industry suffered under catastrophic bombings and resource shortages. After the devastating defeat at Stalingrad in the winter of 42-43 and the failed tank offensive at Kursk in the summer of 43, the strategic initiative was definitively lost. The Red Army advanced relentlessly westward, while the Allies, after landing in Normandy in June 44, pressed Germany from the west. Hitler and his inner circle increasingly clung to the idea of a technological miracle that could immediately reverse the course of the war. The German leadership believed that superior technology could compensate for numerical and material inferiority. This hope became an obsession that consumed ever more resources. This myth was actively stoked by propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels. He wanted to kill two birds with one stone, maintain the fighting morale of the exhausted population and troops through the promise of imminent retaliation against the enemies, and justify the growing deprivations through the necessity of a decisive breakthrough. In his speeches and newspaper articles, he repeatedly promised the imminent unveiling of weapons that would plunge the world into astonishment. Yet the practice of developing, producing, and applying these systems proved far more complex and tragic than the propagandistic fantasies. It was a story of grandiose ambitions, genuine technological innovations, devastating miscalculations, and the monstrous price that was paid for it. The vengeance weapons, V1 and V2. The most famous and actually deployed examples of what can conditionally be called superweapons were the cruise missiles and ballistic rockets, V1 and V2. The V stood for vengeance, a propagandistic term that was meant to portray the attacks as revenge for Allied bombings of German cities. The V1, developed by the Fieseler Works, represented an aircraft missile with a pulsating air-jet engine. This primitive but effective engine produced the characteristic buzzing noise, which is why the British called the weapon doodlebug or buzz bomb. The rocket was about 8.2 meters long, had a wingspan of 5.2 meters, and carried a warhead of 850 kilograms. Its launches on London and other cities began in the summer of 1944, more precisely on June 13th. In the following months, about 9,500 V1s were fired at England. Although the psychological effect was considerable and the destruction real, about 6,000 people died from V-1 attacks. The weapon was relatively slow, with a speed of about 650 kilometers per hour. It was vulnerable to interception by fighters and anti-aircraft fire, and its accuracy left much to be desired. About 25% of the launched V-1s did not reach their target area. Far more revolutionary was the V-2 rocket by Wernher von Braun and his team in Peenemünde. This was the world's first guided ballistic long-range rocket, a milestone in spaceflight and rocket technology. The V-2 was 14 meters long, had a diameter of 1.65 meters, and weighed over 13 tons at launch. Its liquid rocket engine burned ethanol and liquid oxygen and generated a thrust of about 25 tons. Its flight at supersonic speed, up to 5,600 kilometers per hour, on a ballistic trajectory, made interception impossible with the technologies of the time. The rocket climbed to an altitude of about 88 kilometers, thus practically reaching the edge of space before plunging down on its target. The V-2 attacks, which began in September 1944, were sudden and devastating. There was no warning. The rocket hit its target before the sound of its supersonic flight reached the people. Between September 1944 and March 1945, about 3,200 V-2 rockets were launched, mainly against London, Antwerp, and other targets. They killed about 9,000 people, of which about 2,500 in London. But this rocket also had enormous disadvantages, colossal production costs. Each V-2 cost about 100,000 Reichsmarks, while a tank cost about 112,000. The accuracy was low, with a dispersion of several kilometers. In addition, in the late war phase, there was a shortage of important materials like high-quality steel and qualified workers. It should be added that the production of V-1s and V-2s was accompanied by horrific exploitation of forced labor in concentration camps like Mittelbau-Dora, where more than 20,000 prisoners had to work under inhuman conditions. Approximately 9,000 to 12,000 of them died of malnutrition, disease, and brutal treatment, more than the number of people killed by the weapons themselves. The revolution underwater. The maritime hopes were linked to a new generation of submarines, especially Type 21. These boats, which received the nickname Electro boats, were a qualitative leap in submarine construction and represented a fundamental departure from previous concepts. Traditional submarines were essentially surface ships that could dive. They spent most of their time on the surface and dove only for attack or escape. Type 21 was the first true submarine, designed primarily for underwater travel. They had a revolutionary streamlined hull shape that minimized water resistance, powerful accumulators with a capacity of 672 kilowatt-hours, which enabled long and fast underwater voyages up to 17 knots for about 90 minutes, or 5 knots for 60 hours. A snorkel allowed the operation of the diesel engines at periscope depth for battery recharging without having to surface fully. The boat was equipped with improved hydroacoustic equipment and automated torpedo fire control systems. Type 21 was much less vulnerable to the traditional Allied anti-submarine measures, which were based on detecting the boat on the surface by radar or while recharging batteries. Its high underwater speed made it hard to track. But the war was already nearing its end, and it was not possible to establish mass production of these complex boats. Production suffered from material shortages, bomb damage to shipyards, and a lack of experienced workers. Of the planned several hundred boats, only about 118 Type 21s were completed, and only 2 or 3 managed to go on enemy patrols before Germany's capitulation in May 1945. Their actual influence on the war was negligible, but their design became the prototype for post-war submarines worldwide, both in the Soviet Union and in the USA. Further fantastic projects. The concept of the wonder weapon also permeated other, partly completely fantastic areas. Super heavy tanks of incredible dimensions and mass were developed, like the Mouse, with a weight of 188 tons, the heaviest tank ever built. Only 2 prototypes were completed, and none ever saw combat deployment. Such giants were impractical on the battlefield due to lack of mobility, enormous fuel consumption, and vulnerability to air attacks. No bridge could bear their weight. Intensive work was done on various anti-aircraft missile systems, like Wasserfall, Rheintochter, and Schmetterling. These wire-guided or radio-controlled missiles were supposed to fend off Allied bomber streams. Some reached advanced test stages, but none became operational in significant numbers before the end of the war. There were projects for gigantic long-range guns to shell London from the continent, like the V3, also known as high-pressure pump or millipede. This multi-barreled gun, with a length of 132 meters, was supposed to fire shells over a distance of 165 kilometers. However, the facility was bombed by the Royal Air Force before it was operational. The most exotic ideas, like a hypothetical orbital sun